Okay, so when we last saw the ancient mariner, he had expressed beauty, and recognized the beauty of even the ugly things in the world, and had, as a result, sort of been forgiven. The albatross had fallen off his neck, and this is a good thing, and it leads to all sorts of craziness because, in some ways, good things are about to happen, but he's not quite done paying the price for shooting the albatross in the first place. So there are a lot of mystical parts that really sort of take over this work in part five. There's a lot of stuff going on with spirits, very interestingly, and also really kind of fascinatingly is that after he gives his penance and everything, it says, the loud wind never reached the ship, yet now the ship moved on. Beneath the lightning and the moon, the dead men gave a groan. They groaned, they stirred, they all uprose, nor spake, nor moved their eyes. It had been strange, even in a dream, to see those dead men rise. So crazily enough, at this point, all of those 200 men who had all died and cursed him, all of them come back to life. They're not actually back to life, but all of them are sort of inhabited by angelic spirits. They don't have souls necessarily, but they're these angelic spirits that are inhabiting these bodies and helping move things along. Interestingly enough, sort of in a late reveal, is that we find out it says the body of my brother's son stood by me knee to knee. And I think it's really kind of interesting that hadn't been told to us earlier, but it actually says the body of my brother's son. So his nephew was one of the people who was on this boat, and actually was one of the people who cursed him with his eyes. So that's interesting, just to go into more detail about the actual suffering of the mariner, dealing with this life in death, that he has to undergo this horrible, horrible penance. So all of that stuff is happening. And then at the end of part five, when things seem like they're all going really well, right? The boat's moving of its own volition, but then all of a sudden it just stops. And then there are two voices. Okay, and the voices are usually considered to be one of them representing curiosity, the other one representing knowledge. And it says, "Is it he," quoth one, "is this the man by him who died on cross? With his cruel bow he laid full low the harmless albatross." And then it says, "The spirit who bideth by himself in the land of mist and snow, he loved the bird that loved the man who shot him with his bow. The other was a softer voice, as soft as honey dew, quoth he, the man hath penance done, and penance more will do." So that one, the one responding with the softer voice, that's the one representing knowledge, not asking the question, but just making the declaration. He's paid some price, but penance more shall do. His suffering is not yet over. And this conversation between them continues on into part six, where they talk about things. But ultimately, eventually, to make a long story short in that regard, eventually, they sort of let go, and they let him go on his way. And then, fantastically enough, in part six, he actually sees his homeland. He has been sort of whisked back home, and it says, "Oh, dream of joy, is this indeed the lighthouse top I see? Is this the hill? Is this the kirk?" Kirk being a word for church, of course. "Is this mine own country?" So he finally, he's able to be back home, and all of the angels, all of the seraph band, each waved his hand. It was a heavenly sight. So all the angels which inhabited the bodies, they all ascend back to heaven, and then he and the boat are going to be coming into shore. And although the boat, begins sinking, he is saved by the pilot's boy, and the hermit. And in part seven, there's some interesting things that happen there as we finally get to the last part of this complicated, crazy sort of ghost story poem that raises all of these issues. And many big ones come up here in the seventh part. One of them is that the pilot's boy, one of the people who saves him, thinks that the mariner is the devil, which is sort of a telling thing, and you actually have to start considering, is the mariner the devil? Is he somebody who, was sort of like stricken down, who did a terrible thing and then has been sort of paying the price ever since? I don't know. It's just something to consider. Other things to consider are, what does the hermit represent? Does he represent piety? Does he represent loneliness? And a really tough question. Here's a really tough one. how does the superstition of the sailors, remember how superstitious they were? How does that compare to the faith of the hermit? Is his faith justified? Was the mariner's experience, if true, his own personal revelation of the work of God? Oh man, those are big issues, and they're the types of questions that Coleridge doesn't necessarily answer for us. He just sort of throws them out there for us to then have to, consider and debate on our own. But there's a lot of, fascinating stuff going on with them in which you have to deal with them. One thing I think is really, really fascinating here is what the hermit asks the mariner. He says, "What manner of man art thou?" Okay? And the thing that's interesting here is he asks this question, and then it's sort of like, And then the mariner kind of answers him by telling him the story. So I wonder this issue where it's like, is the answer to the question, what type of person are you? Is that the story that the mariner has gone through? Is that this plight that he suffered? Is this the microcosm of his life? Is this the thing that explains who he is and sort of accounts for him as a person? And I think that's really fascinating because it raises the question. This is one for you directly to consider, is if when somebody asks the mariner, what type of person are you? He tells this story. If somebody asks you, what type of person are you? How do you answer that question? What's the story that you tell that is going to be the embodiment of who you are as a person, that's going to answer that question, that's going to account for you as a person? Okay, what would you tell? What thing have you experienced that would demonstrate the richness of your character, the ups, the downs, the ethical quandaries that you've encountered, the decisions that you've made, the ideas of what's important to you and what you've endured? How would you explain that? For the ancient mariner, this is the story that he tells. I think that that's a fascinating thing to consider. Some other complicated questions are, again, that question, why the wedding guest? Why this guy? And the thing is that ultimately at the end of this, we don't know. We don't have enough information. The idea is that, it says that basically, the ancient mariner, he will tell the story when he sees a person and it's obvious that that person needs to hear it. So it makes you wonder about this wedding guest. What's this guy got going on? Is he a superstitious person? Has he done horrible, wrong things? Is he questionable ethics? Does he not see the beauty in the world? These are all open possibilities, and we don't know. But for some reason, when the ancient mariner saw this guy, he was like, that's the person who needs to hear the story. So that's a complicated issue. Also, and here's a really interesting thing I think you'll appreciate, is that some scholars have actually argued that when the mariner was hung with the albatross, that in fact symbolized his crucifixion. Yeah, that's a big one, right? That symbolizes his crucifixion, thus allowing for the salvation of others. So the ancient mariner, his crucifixion is having the albatross hung around his neck and having to endure this huge trial, and that him going through that gives him the story so that then he can go tell the story to other people, that he can evangelize his story and therefore save these other people from having to endure this horrible thing. And that, of course, there at the end, the very end of the poem, it says, "The mariner, whose eye is bright, whose beard with age is hoar, is gone, and now the wedding guest turned from the bridegroom's door. He went like one that hath been stunned, and is of a sense forlorn. A sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn." So he's both sadder and wiser. And one of the big questions, you can see how he'd be wiser, but why is he sadder? Is there something that he's realized? What is the awakening that he's had here? What's the epiphany? So lots of stuff to think about. Also, another couple interesting things. One, why is this romantic? It's romantic for a lot of reasons. The notion of nature, the appreciation of nature, the sort of rebelling against the idea of just believing things for superstitious reasons. Also, the fact that it's very stylistically free. It takes a lot of risks. In fact, Wordsworth, who's an interesting character in his own right, this was part of the Lyrical Ballads book along with Wordsworth poems, and Wordsworth actually said, he said, and I quote, From what I gather, it seems that the Ancient Mariner has, upon the whole, been an injury to the volume, the strangeness of it having deterred readers from going on. So Wordsworth, sort of Coleridge's partner, actually said that, this is a problematic work. But now, in retrospect, we can look back at it and recognize it for the genius that it was. When it first came out, people tended to be a little bit confused, and actually, Coleridge put, those little things, those little explanations next to the poem itself, the little tiny things where it says basically what's happening in the work. That's called a gloss. Okay, and that gloss is something that Coleridge actually added in nearly 20 years after the original publication. Some people have complained when it didn't have the gloss in there. Other people complained when he put it in. So that's just something for you to consider. Would you have understood the poem as well without having that gloss there? So these are all interesting things to consider. But I think the biggest thing to take away from this poem is its sort of closing message. Okay, and this is this little bit here right before the end where it says, "Farewell, farewell, but this I tell to thee, thou wedding guest, he prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small, for the dear God who loveth us had he made and loveth all." And that issue right there, where it's like not just special things or beautiful things are part of God's creation. It's that in this context, everything is part of God's creation, and everything, therefore, should be appreciated. You should see the beauty in the ugliness. You should see the snake and think that it's beautiful. You should see the slimy thing and think it's beautiful. You should love a beast or a bird just as much of a man. And I think that that's sort of the ultimate takeaway. And for the Ancient Mariner, for him to learn that harsh lesson, he had to take the life without thinking of a bird. And by paying the price, he figured it all out.